Hello, and welcome to another episode of Canadian History X. The Big Bend Haunted Detachment. First established in 1887, the Big Bend Detachment was once located south of Fort Macleod, Alberta, and for a time served as an important stopping point along the way to Montana. Due to the Whiskey Gap nearby, where smugglers would bring whiskey up through the United States, the Big Bend Detachment got plenty of traffic and was a busy location. At the turn of the century, the importance of the detachment lessened until it closed in 1917. In 1923, it reopened as a camp for sick horses and was once again closed in 1926. From that detachment comes a very spooky ghost story as told in 10 Years of Trek. A corporal, identified as Corporal Zed, was stationed at the detachment with a sergeant and several constables. One night in January, during a severe blizzard, the 6 men at the detachment decided to sleep in one room to conserve warmth. Going to bed at 10:30 p.m., Corporal Zed looked out the door to see the blizzard had let up. Not only had it let up, but the skies were clear and the moon was shining. 2 hours later, at 12:30 a.m., the corporal woke up upon hearing spurs jingling and the footsteps of a horse. The corporal then heard the sound of someone getting off the horse and walking up to the door. This was followed by 3 knocks. The corporal told the visitor to come in, and he lit a match to give some light. 2 of the other men at the detachment woke up at this point, and all 3 men waited for the visitor to enter. But he never did. The visitor again walked along the veranda, and then knocked 3 times at the door. One of the constables then said, "Hurry up and come in! The door is undone, you'll freeze to death out there!" No one answered, but the visitor again knocked 3 times at the door. At this point, the corporal was irritated and assumed it was an intoxicated individual. He got out of bed and threw the door open, discovering that there was no one outside. He called one of the constables to the door and both men looked around for the visitor. They saw no one, and the snow around the building had not been disturbed with footprints. The men then stepped back from the door and locked it, something that was rarely ever done. The next morning, the men went out and looked through the detachment grounds for any sign of the visitor. Finding nothing, the corporal and the 2 constables who were awake that night quickly applied for transfers and secured them. There are many stories of the First Nations princess buried on an island in Ontario who haunts the area now. The most common story centers on Polly Cow, a daughter of a First Nations chief named Handsome Jack Cow, who stood at 6'4" and was 250 pounds. Now Handsome Jack dearly loved his daughter Polly, and Polly was in love with the son of another tribal chief named Now Gone. Handsome Jack was not happy about this, and he forbid his daughter from seeing the boy. To keep them apart, he moved further down the lake. Soon after their separation, Polly Cow developed a fever and died at the age of 16. Her father was stricken with grief, and he took her body to an island in the lake, now called Polly Cow Island, and dug a grave by hand for her. He also placed a cup in her grave so that she could walk the path to the water to drink each night. People in the area began to see the spirit of Polly Cow moving down to the water to drink each night. One story tells of a time when dredging was being conducted near the island, and a worker was tasked with staying overnight at the island to watch the dredge. As the other men were halfway across the lake, they heard the man screaming and yelling for them to come back. Assuming the dredge was on fire, they came back, and when they did, they found him scared out of his mind after hearing the screaming of a woman, and he refused to stay alone on the island another minute. They tried to persuade him, but he refused, and another man had to take his place. Sometimes the legend of a place comes from a haunting, and that creates a literal name of the place, as we see with these places in Alberta. Ghost Pine Creek is located near 3 Hills, and according to legend, a group of Blackfoot First Nations raided a sleeping camp of Cree in 1830. They murdered every man, woman, and child, but one Cree warrior survived since he was away hunting. When he returned, he found everyone dead. Painting his face black from mourning, he set out to find the Blackfoot. He then killed as many of the raiding party as he could. For many years after, First Nations avoided the Ghost Pine Lake, now known as Pine Lake, because they thought the region was haunted by the people murdered there. Located near Stettler, the name for haunted lakes comes from the tale of a group of First Nations who saw a deer on a frozen lake. They went to kill it, but fell through the ice and drowned. Another legend says that 2 young First Nations saw a large elk in the middle of the lake, and they went out to hunt him. Before they could reach the elk, his large antlers started to move mysteriously, and before the ice suddenly broke, taking the young men into the water. According to folklore, the lake has been haunted by these men ever since. Near Fort McMurray, it is said that the trappers avoided Crazy Lake because they could hear voices there when no one was around. Dogs were terrified of the lake as well, and as people approached the lake, they would often get an eerie feeling. It would seem to get darker around the lake, sound would get muffled, and the voices of the spirits of the people killed at the lake could be heard. Late one summer night in the early 20th century, 3 brothers were returning from the village. All 3 were intoxicated and very loud. 2 of the men were sitting in the front seat of the wagon, with a 3rd brother, named Robert, sitting by himself in the back. The road was rough and dark, and Robert was drinking from a bottle when the wagon jolted, and he fell out of the back. A large man, he fell on a projecting root and broke his neck, killing him instantly. The other 2 brothers did not realize what had happened, and they continued on their way and went home to bed. It was not until the next morning that Robert was found dead by neighbors. And for years after this incident, travelers on the road said they would see a strange figure, no more than 4 feet in height, moving back and forth along the road. The figure was stout, with no neck and 2 eyes of blazing fire. The mouth of the apparition was always partly open, with his tongue sticking out. The voice was low, and whenever it would appear, the dogs in the area would howl, and the cattle and horses would throw a fit. The ghost would utter moans and groans that terrified the people traveling on the road. But only one word could be understood, and that was the Gaelic word for drink. The figure was always seen with his right hand holding where the neck would be, and holding a black bottle. One night, an elder in the church was on the road, and he came upon the ghost. He held out his Bible, and for the first time the ghost apparently said a full sentence. He said, "This is the last time I shall appear on earth, for tonight I would have died had I not been killed 20 years ago on this spot." After that, the ghost was never seen again. In Annapolis, Nova Scotia, the Barclay house was known for several ghosts that haunted the premises. The home was where several prominent families lived in the 1700s, including the Delanceys and the Barclays. It was also where several dignitaries would visit when they came to Nova Scotia, including the Duke of Kent on his first visit to Annapolis. Eventually, it was the home of Colonel Barclay and his wife, who was known for being very cruel to her slaves. Residents of the area said that she would tie the slaves up in the attic by their thumbs as punishment. One day, one of the slaves had stolen a piece of pie and consumed most of it, giving the rest to the hogs. Mrs. Barclay found the slave and made him crawl through the hog pen until he found the crust, at which point he had to eat it. There's also the rumor that Mrs. Barclay murdered a slave there and sealed the body in the fireplace. From that moment on, residents of the home said it was haunted. Some former occupants have stated they would see a woman in a checkered shawl rocking herself back and forth in the bedroom. They believed it to be Mrs. Barclay herself, watching over the house that she once lived in. In Burlington, Ontario, there is the Herberton House, named for the grandson of Henry Wyatt, Herbert Marsh. Wyatt was born in 1797 in England and came to Canada with his wife and family in 1841. Eventually, they would settle in Burlington and build this house. The woodwork of the house was carved by hand, the glass imported from England, and the bricks made on the property. In the house, residents have said they could hear someone walking around through the front hall of the house into the kitchen, and it seems to happen nearly on a regular basis at 8 p.m. The ghost appears to be friendly, and residents have said it's just Henry Wyatt, checking to make sure that his house is being cared for by those who live there now. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Canadian History X, and if you did, please give it a like and a review. You can also reach me through email at crwbaird@gmail.com and on Twitter at craigbAird.